January 2010. Residents in Shreveport, Louisiana are enjoying the fresh start of a new decade.
Shreveport is a wonderful place to live. It's a little laid back. We've got a lot of military influence because there's a military base in the adjoining city.
Just outside Shreveport is one of the largest Air Force bases in the world.
Shreveport is home of the Barksdale Air Force Base and is a place where you have friendly people and exciting entertainment.
However, the lively entertainment in Shreveport can come at a price.
Shreveport's very vibrant. Nightlife also comes with a lot of violent crime throughout the nights. There's continual shootings, robberies that kept the city a lot of times not very safe.
Around 4 a.m. on January 17th, a night of typical Shreveport revelry is coming to an end. But one couple's worst nightmare is just beginning.
Shreveport Police, what's your emergency?
I'm gonna try to kill my boyfriend.
Am I gonna kill your boyfriend?
The frantic caller identifies herself as 26-year-old Camethea Coleman.
She stated her boyfriend, Brian Spinks, and herself had been viciously attacked.
She said that a man came into her boyfriend's apartment and stabbed him several times.
Okay, is he still there?
Yes, it's just left. I was fighting Mom.
She tried to fight off the attacker, but he stabbed her too.
She sustained injuries as a result, but her boyfriend, Brian, sustained much more severe injuries.
911 operators can hear Brian's voice in the background, so there's still a chance to save him if they move quickly.
Oh. Baby, are you okay? Please help me.
Miss Coleman calling 911 was very, very emotional and crying, screaming.
Okay, I need you to calm down. We're getting police there.
First responders are immediately en route to the scene. But while on the call, the operator can hear Brian's moans become faint and eventually stop.
Say something! Brian! Say something to me, please!
29-year-old Brian Spinks was destined for a life of service to his country.
Brian came from a military family. His grandfather was in the Air Force. My father was in the Army in World War II. Myself, I was in the Marine Corps.
Brian sought to follow his father's footsteps. After graduating high school, he immediately enlisted in the U.S. Air Force.
I was proud that my son decided to follow in the military footsteps of his forebears.
Brian loved being in the Air Force and serving his country.
Brian immediately built a reputation as a person who would always go the extra mile for others and show up for his friends and fellow servicemen.
No matter who they were or where they were from, Brian was a man with an open heart and open arms.
Brian also prided himself on being a dedicated father to his 2 children.
There's a lot on him as far as, juggling his time, but Brian really loved his kids, and he really put in a lot of effort to make sure that they were well taken care of.
With his skill and reputation, it didn't take Brian long to earn a promotion to staff sergeant.
Brian was well on his way, climbing the ladder of the military ranks.
After almost 10 years of service, with 4 deployments and 2 tours in Iraq, Brian found himself stationed at Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana.
It was there Brian met someone who'd change his life forever. 24-year-old Camethea Coleman.
Ooh, man, it's chilly out here tonight.
I know, right?
While at a house party in 2008, destiny struck, and Brian met Camethea. She was different from any woman he'd ever met before.
So you're in the military?
Yeah, Air Force,
Well, I love a man in uniform.
The spark just kind of flew from there.
Brian was immediately drawn to her. Camethea was the perfect combination of brains and sexy.
I have a career in social work. It's what I've always wanted to do since I was a little girl.
Wow, I mean, that's great.
She attended Grambling State University, where she earned a degree.
She wanted to help others in their lives, and that was something that Brian could relate to. And it didn't take Brian long to become completely head over heels smitten with her.
They began dating not too long after that first meeting.
Soon enough, Brian was proudly introducing Camethea to his loved ones.
He just lit up when he, talked about the possibility of getting to start building a relationship with her. And he was excited about that.
Well, Dad, this is Camethea.
Oh my gosh, very nice to meet you.
You too, sir.
All right.
She's the first young lady I ever met. She and I connected quite a bit. And I just knew, and he told me, that she was something special.
Brian felt like Camethea completed him in many ways, and to everybody else, they were the perfect couple.
Yeah, she's great.
We were excited for him because we had never really seen him in a real, long-term type of relationship. So I was happy that he met somebody he could potentially see a future with.
I was amazed at how she lit the light bulb in him. This was the one.
But now, the couple's promising future is at risk of being cut short as police and EMS race to Brian's apartment in response to a violent stabbing. They know time is of the essence if they're going to save Brian's life.
As authorities arrive, they come across a grotesquely violent scene.
Camethea is covered in blood, and Brian is even more blood-soaked.
Camethea is crying hysterically.
While paramedics attempt to revive Brian, officers tend to Camethea.
They are asking if she could recall anything about the attacker so that they could, try to catch up with him before he would get too far.
What is wet?
What's he look? What's he look like? What's he look like, man?
Camethea is just hysterical. She's bleeding, and she couldn't answer any of their questions.
Police are concerned there is a violent man on the loose, but with such few details, they fear he will get away.
Who is this man, and why did he want to harm this young couple?
After spending nearly a decade in the Air Force, 29-year-old Brian Spinks was a young staff sergeant looking forward to the bright future ahead of him.
Brian just wanted to be the best person he could be, the best airman he could be, and the best father he could be.
And his future looked even brighter with his new girlfriend, Camethea Coleman, by his side.
Brian was crazy about that young lady.
So we were all happy for him.
But on January 17th, 2010, first responders had been called to Brian's apartment after a panicked 911 call from Camethea.
Brian is losing blood fast.
They've both been stabbed by an intruder.
Man, tell me what he looks like. Blackout. That's all we got right now.
First responders do everything they can to revive Brian. Unfortunately, though, their work is futile.
Despite their best efforts, first responders were unable to revive Brian. He was pronounced dead on the scene, and this home invasion has now become a murder investigation.
Will Camethea suffer a similar fate?
She has been stabbed 5 times, twice in the abdomen, once on each leg and on one hand.
They quickly take her to the hospital for more treatment.
Meanwhile, homicide detectives arrive to begin their investigation.
As we entered the house and began looking at the victim, we noticed that he had received multiple stab wounds
Brian's body is covered in stab wounds, over 60 to be exact.
Stab wounds all around the neck. Definitely overkill.
There were multiple stab wounds on his chest and arms.
But two wounds in particular stand out to the detectives. A deep stab wound at the base of Brian's neck and a slash across his throat.
He had received a laceration from one ear to the other across his throat.
Obviously, whoever did this did not intend to just rough him up. They intended to kill him.
Blood spatter can be found all over the apartment.
This is the worst crime scene that I've ever seen in my career as a police officer.
By the looks of this gruesome scene, it's clear that the assailant was relentless.
As detectives continue to process the crime scene, they find not one, but two murder weapons.
We noticed the two knives laying next to the victim. One of the knife blades was broken.
Most likely, the first knife broke during the midst of all the stabbing, and the second knife was used to finish the job.
As we began reviewing the rest of the residence, we noticed that there were two missing knives from the knife block in the kitchen, and the knives that were used to kill the victim appeared to be the same make of the knives that were in the kitchen block.
But what was the killer's motive?
It could not have been robbery because everything in the apartment that was valuable was undisturbed.
There was only violence. Whoever had done this seemed to have a serious grudge against Brian.
When the tragic news reaches Brian's loved ones, they're in disbelief.
They told me that my son has been the victim of a homicide. And immediately denial set in because I started trying to differentiate homicide means he's dead. I didn't know the exact details other than my son was deceased, and I had to get that in to my heart some way.
I had a whole bunch of missed phone calls, and one of the voicemails was from one of our friends that was stationed with us at the base. And I called him back, and he was like, he said, they bodied Spinks. He was like, turn on your computer. And that's when I saw the news article online. And it was just like, stomach dropped. I could not believe what I was reading. Just confusion, shock, sadness.
As one team of investigators continues processing the scene, another begins canvassing the neighborhood for leads.
Brian's neighbor tells detectives that she thought Brian and Camethea were a lovely couple, and she'd never had any problems with them outside of the occasional loud party.
But last night was different.
The neighbor remembered being awoken due to screaming and yelling.
She was awoken by a commotion around 3:15 that morning. She heard yelling back and forth, but she really couldn't make out the words.
She didn't actually see anything helpful, and neither did anyone else in the neighborhood.
Except for Camethea.
She was really the key to unlocking what happened.
We needed to speak to Camethea Coleman immediately to get more details.
And fortunately, detectives soon receive word that Camethea is ready to talk.
Detective Bowen, she's good to go.
They are notified she's in stable condition.
Luckily, her wounds are not fatal.
So once Ms. Coleman was brought from the hospital, she was brought into the detective office.
When detectives meet with Camethea, she is clearly still shaken up. But she says she has something very important to tell them.
She says she knows exactly who killed Brian.
I saw him earlier that day. Saw him riding by.
Camethea reveals she has a stalker, and he is the one who did this.
In the winter of 2010, Shreveport homicide detectives are investigating the brutal slaying of 29-year-old Brian Spinks.
He was stabbed over 60 times with his own kitchen knife. Obviously, whoever did this didn't intend to injure him. They intended to kill him.
Brian's girlfriend, Camethea Coleman, was also stabbed during the attack, but has survived.
Now Camethea is telling the investigators that she knew the attacker.
She was so distraught and emotional at the scene, but now that her mind has settled and she's calmed down, she in fact did recognize the attacker.
I saw him earlier that day. Saw him riding by.
She advised that an individual was stalking her.
What's this guy's name?
John. He said his name was John.
Do you know what John's last name was? Describe John for me.
He's dark. He's probably like a little taller than me.
She told police that she'd met him at a club a while back.
We were talking, but I told him there would never be anything because I was with Brian.
According to Camethea, John wouldn't take no for an answer.
He was aggressively trying to pursue her, and he'd been following her.
He got the picture, but then he showed back up. He would pop up like in crazy places.
In fact, Camethea says on the afternoon of January 16th, John popped up outside her apartment.
So this is before about 2 or 3 in the afternoon?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Did he say anything to you? You just saw him or what? Did y'all talk? Be strong for me, girl, okay? We gotta find out.
Through tears, Camethea tells detectives John didn't say anything to her that afternoon, but later that night, she still couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched.
She'd been out club hopping with her friends, and as the bars began to close, she decided it might be best to go to Brian's house to go to sleep, as she often did when she was out late.
I missed you.
You went over to his apartment. I know. It's painful, okay? But I'm here for you. Tell me what happened when you got to the apartment.
When I got there, we were just talking.
Until the night took a frightening turn.
Suddenly, a man burst through the door. Camethea said she immediately recognized him as John.
Oh, follow me.
Camethea says when John arrived, she was alarmed, but she never could have imagined what happened next.
And I was like, what are you doing here? He went to the kitchen.
That's when John started stabbing Brian.
John, get out! What are you doing?
What?
Get out!
What the hell are you doing, bro?
Get out! And he got the knife and he just started jabbing.
Camethea says she was in shock as she watched the violence unfold.
I was looking at John. I was like, get out of here.
But John was relentless.
The first knife broke during the midst of all the stabbing.
Then he was just using one knife and was stabbing Brian repeatedly. Camethea said she then knew she had to do something.
When Brian was on the ground, I jumped on him.
Please, no.
That's when John turned the knife on her.
No. Stop!
As the investigation into the violent murder of Brian Spinks continues, detectives are speaking with his girlfriend, Camethea Coleman, who was also injured during the crime.
Camethea says that her stalker, who she only knows as John, broke into Brian's apartment and began stabbing him.
When Brian was on the ground, I jumped on him, and that's when he stabbed me on my leg. I know I felt a couple of a couple of them.
Camethea says at that point, she runs to grab her phone and call 911.
When John saw this, he slit Brian's throat, plunged a knife into his neck, and ran out of the door.
Camethea said with the phone to her ear, she ran to Brian's side.
Shaking him. I didn't know what to do, and I pulled a knife out of Brian.
She removes the knife from his neck, and shortly after, first responders arrive.
Based on the story that Camethea had given detectives, if John had followed her home, it's possible that it was an act of jealousy.
The plan was simple. Find the boyfriend, take him out, get the girl. But detectives know they'll have to investigate further to determine whether or not this was in fact the case.
In their search for more information on the couple, detectives turn to Brian and Camethea's friends, and what they discover is eye-opening.
Camethea had a dark side to her.
Brian had dropped some lines to me about like, hey man, she's, Kim kind of crazy. We started seeing a change in their relationship, and she was being clingy and asking more questions about what he was doing and stuff like that.
What are you talking about?
Camethea always thought that he was looking for another person to be with.
I'm not letting you see my phone. No, stop.
Her behavior over Brian became controlling.
She's becoming more and more compulsive. We wake up in the middle of the night, she's in his phone. She's looking under the bed, she's looking in the closet, looking for something that wasn't there.
You're acting crazy.
What did you just call me?
Friends say, despite the tumultuous nature of their relationship, Camethea even began pressuring Brian to get married.
For Brian, this was too much, and he began to feel suffocated in the relationship.
Brian has a son and a daughter, and he was doing his regular Air Force job and school. And he just wanted a little time to himself sometime.
So Brian decided to distance himself from Camethea.
I need some space.
What?
I need some space.
No, you can't.
No, I'm
you
done.
can't leave, Brian.
No.
But Camethea wasn't having it.
There are times where we've been out and we saw Kim at different places.
She was popping up everywhere. Anytime he and his friends went out for drinks, went out to the club, anything, she was there, and it was quickly becoming a problem.
It was starting to sound like Camethea was the true stalker.
Friends say the situation came to a head on the night of January 16th, the same night Brian was killed.
It was just a regular night. We went downtown, we were having drinks, listening to music.
Brian was in the club, and he was doing what they call the Texas two-step with this young lady. This young lady was the girlfriend of one of Brian's good friends, and her boyfriend is present as well.
But then Camethea showed up.
As soon as Camethea came face to face with the woman, all hell broke loose.
What the hell do you think you're doing?
Stop it.
My man.
They couldn't believe that she had started a fight in the club.
Back up. No.
Camethea Coleman has told Shreveport detectives that her boyfriend, Brian Spinks, was killed by her jealous stalker, who she only knows as John. But now detectives are wondering if the true stalker is Camethea.
He was trying to separate himself. She was trying to control him.
Brian's friends say Camethea's possessive behavior came to a head on the night of his death.
Brian had gone out with some of his friends. Everyone was drinking. And then Miss Coleman appeared at that establishment.
She saw Brian hanging out with another woman who was actually just a friend and completely lost it.
What the hell do you think you're doing? This is my man, and you better stay away from him.
Camethea began screaming at her to stay away from Brian.
Don't tell me to relax. Don't tell me
me to relax. No, I knew you was cheating on me, Brian.
People were trying to calm her down, telling her to relax. And we pulled her off to the side and we're like, hey man, chill out. Like, we're all having a good time. He cares about you, he loves you. Just relax.
Don't tell me to relax. Don't tell me to relax.
Comethia had clearly gone off the handle, and it didn't go unnoticed by Brian.
No.
That's it.
Brian.
I'm done.
No, you're not done.
That's
We're
it.
not done. Don't you walk away from me, Brian. This is not over. Don't walk away. Get off of me. Get off of me.
He had enough of that type of reaction from her. And I think he just was fed up with it and was like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. At that point, Brian told one of her friends, like, look, just take me home.
On the ride home, Brian decided to end his relationship with Comethia for good.
Brian's friend stated that he had left a voicemail saying, I am done with you.
After speaking with Brian's friends, detectives think they now know the real reason Comethia went over to Brian's house that night.
If Brian finally pulled the plug on their relationship, it's likely that Comethia was not there just to talk. She went to his home to confront him.
At this point, Comethia Coleman has made the shift from innocent victim to suspect number one.
She does have every motive to do Brian harm.
They believe it's time to have another sit-down with Comethia Coleman.
Investigators called Comethia in with no trouble under the guise of following up on Brian's investigation.
Once she arrived, they informed her that she was now a suspect in Brian's murder.
What happened last night?
What I told you.
You do realize that if I prove that you're lying to me, that you're going to go to jail for the rest of your life. You do not come out of prison on a murder charge in Louisiana. So I'm giving you the opportunity now to set the record straight, okay?
But Comethia isn't budging.
She sticks to her original statement, saying John, her stalker, is the main suspect they need to be looking into.
What do you want to find? I mean, I've told you.
I want to find out the honest truth. How many times you guys have been knocked down, dragged out, getting into it?
Although Comethia continues to insist she didn't kill Brian, she does admit that their relationship had become rocky in recent months.
I need some space.
We're dating, but I mean, we've been off and on for I don't know how long.
She also admits that she ran into Brian at the club that night, but says it wasn't planned.
We learned that Brian and Comethia had made a pact if they were going to go out separately, not to go to the same establishment.
They both agreed that spending quality time away from each other was important for a successful relationship.
We just never go to the same club together. It was just our thing.
But Comethia claims on the night of January 16th, she accidentally showed up at the same club Brian and his friends were already at.
When she saw him, she approached him and calmly asked him not to be mad at her.
I was calm. I just wanted to talk to him.
But it was no use. She said that Brian was livid.
You keep doing this. I need you to...
He was like, why were you there? And he was pissed. He was mad at me.
She advised that she had gone to the apartment to talk to Brian to try and calm things over because of what happened at the club, trying to work things out with him. But Brian was not having it.
I told you, you don't listen.
Comethia says he began squeezing her hand very hard and it hurt.
Go. He just I told you.
She claimed that Brian grabbed her throat with one hand and started choking her.
Comethia says she was eventually able to free herself.
You jerked away.
Mm-hmm.
She says she was trying to get out of his apartment immediately.
I was like, push you. I went to the knife out.
She pulled the knife out.
Mm-hmm.
Camethea told investigators he had stabbed her several times before she could get away from him.
And I pushed him. And I was like, if I don't do something, I'll kill you.
So when she freed herself, she dashed to the kitchen to arm herself.
She then confessed to stabbing him, however, stated it was self-defense because Brian had attacked her previously and she was afraid for him to attack her again.
I still have to.
So you just kept stabbing. When did his throat get cut? Because it was cut bad.
Once again, she blames that on this mysterious John character.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he showed up in the middle of y'all fighting?
Somebody's upset with you. What can you do?
Camethea stated that in an attempt to protect her, John took the knife away from Brian and began stabbing him harder and deeper.
Camethea says she begged him to stop, but John was insistent on killing Brian.
I didn't want to go that far. I was just trying to protect myself. I did not want to go that far.
But detectives know that Camethea's story doesn't add up.
All of the evidence collectively was telling that Camethea was the likely murderer, and John the intruder didn't exist.
At this point, Camethea realizes she's in hot water, so she decides to lawyer up.
Can I get a attorney, please?
That's what you want.
Mm-hmm.
Time now is 09:21. Ms. Coleman is requesting an attorney. All tapes will stop at this time.
Regardless of Camethea's new story, investigators have enough to arrest her and charge her with Brian's murder.
But will justice ever be served in this case?
Camethea pleaded not guilty due to reason of insanity.
She was definitely putting on a show.
In January of 2010, Shreveport investigators have Camethea Coleman in custody for the murder of her estranged boyfriend, Brian Spinks.
When I found out that she was under arrest for this, the shock just got even more amplified because this was somebody that he cared about, that we thought cared about him.
The commanding officer called me and he said, she's the one that did it. I said, no way. There's no way. He said, yes, no way did she do it. Yes, she did.
Even with Camethea behind bars, investigators are still discovering additional evidence against her.
A forensic medical examiner studies both Brian's autopsy report as well as Camethea's medical records from the night of the murder.
What they determined was that Camethea's 5 stab wounds were self-inflicted.
Investigators can only assume that Camethea stabbed herself to make it look like she acted in self-defense.
And in the months leading up to trial, Camethea continues going to extreme lengths to avoid taking responsibility for Brian's death.
Camethea pleaded not guilty due to reason of insanity. She stated that she'd blacked out and was completely unaware of what she had done to Brian.
And in July of 2011, she was found to be mentally incompetent to stand trial.
It takes more than a year from Brian's murder for Camethea to undergo enough psychiatric treatment to be deemed fit for trial.
She went to 3 different doctors for competency. And one of the doctors said that she was malingering, that they kind of knew that, that she was acting as if something was wrong with her when there was nothing wrong with her. She was definitely competent and was putting on a show, basically.
On April 23, 2012, Camethea Coleman finally stands before judge and jury.
Camethea stands by her plea of not guilty due to self-defense. She claims she was in a very abusive relationship with Brian, and that night was only the last in a long history of violent nights.
Brian was the opposite of violent. When her defense started saying that, we knew it was way far from the truth that any of that would have ever taken place.
We were all in pain, watching them trying to make my son into a woman abuser with no evidence. She never told anybody she ever got hit, no scratches, no bruises, no reports, no nothing.
When it's their turn, prosecutors describe what they believe actually happened the night Brian was killed.
They believe that Camethea went to confront him about the incident at the club.
Please,
No,
I just
Kim,
want to.
no, Kim,
Will you
I
please
am
listen? I just
done.
want to
No,
talk to you.
talk about what? Kim,
No.
it's over.
Brian said that things are over. And that's when she decided that if she couldn't have him, no one would.
Prosecutors believe that once Brian's back was turned, Camethea grabbed a knife from the butcher's block and stabbed him in the back.
Sick and tired of this.
They argued that then Brian stumbled into the living room where Camethea continued her vicious attack, stabbing him so many times that the knife broke.
Camethea could have stopped there.
But she went back to retrieve another knife after the first steak knife was broken. And she continued to stab him and stab him and stab him.
And then when she felt like Brian wouldn't survive, she called 911 to appear like a concerned girlfriend.
Help me. Somebody trying to kill my boyfriend.
However, Camethea didn't expect Brian to start speaking when she was on the phone with 911.
Concerned that he might say something that gave her away, prosecutors believe that then, with one final push, Camethea inflicted the fatal wound to Brian's throat to keep him quiet.
During the trial, the coroner pointed out that Brian could not have verbalized those words with the damage that was done to the front part of his throat, which means that damage was done to his throat after she made the phone call.
Prosecutors believe that in order to sell her self-defense claim, Camethea turned the knife on herself and made up the bogus story about John the stalker to lead police off her trail.
They believe her story about John was completely fabricated and he did not exist.
A lot of people ask me, like, he was in the military, why didn't he fight her off? He's not a fighter. He's not an aggressive person. Some of the defense marks that we found out that were on him, he was clearly just, balled up, trying to survive, trying to live.
When the jury retires to deliberate, they side with prosecutors.
They unanimously found Camethea guilty of second-degree murder.
Camethea Coleman is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
She got what she deserved. She does not need to be on the streets anywhere for the crime that she committed.
When you hear the words, there is joy, but not joy in a happy way. More a joy and a relief that none of the lies that she said the jury believed. Relief that justice has been, served. And that his family could, start the grieving process, start moving on.
Nobody won anything that night. 2 families lost their children forever. Yeah, she's in jail the rest of her life, but what did anybody win? It didn't bring Brian back.
The world lost a good person, a person that really cared about the people that were in his life.
Brian was crazy about that young lady. And that's the part that hurts. He was murdered by somebody he loved.
The summer nights in Phoenix, Arizona, had always carried a familiar rhythm. The desert air remained warm long after the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The streets stretched endlessly beneath the orange glow of streetlights. Cars moved quietly through wide avenues, passing neighborhoods where families were finishing dinner, children were falling asleep, and people were preparing for another ordinary day. Phoenix was a city built on expansion and possibility. New houses appeared across the desert landscape. Businesses grew. Thousands of people arrived every year searching for a better life in one of America's fastest-growing cities. But in 2005, something changed. The city that had once felt open and predictable began to feel different after sunset. A strange fear started moving through Phoenix. At first, it was only a feeling. A story whispered between neighbors. A warning passed from one person to another. A reminder to be careful when walking alone. A suggestion to look over your shoulder before getting into a car. Then the stories became police reports. A woman attacked near a quiet street. Another victim assaulted in the darkness. A person robbed and left terrified. The details were disturbing, but what frightened investigators most was not only what was happening. It was the realization that the attacks were not random incidents. They were connected. Somewhere in the city, someone was watching. Someone was choosing victims. Someone was waiting for the right moment to strike. And for more than a year, that person would become one of the most feared criminals in Arizona history. His name was Mark Goudeau. But before the public knew his name, before police officers surrounded his home, before a courtroom would decide his fate, the people of Phoenix only knew one thing. There was a predator moving through their city. The media gave him a name that would soon become associated with fear. The Baseline Killer. The name came from Baseline Road, a major route running through southern Phoenix and nearby communities where several attacks occurred. To many residents, Baseline Road was no longer just a street. It became a symbol. A place connected to uncertainty. A reminder that danger could appear anywhere. The killer did not operate like someone driven by a single personal conflict. He did not target one specific person. He did not follow a simple pattern that police could immediately understand. His victims were different ages. They came from different backgrounds. Some were young. Some were older. Some were simply people who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That unpredictability created something more powerful than fear. It created helplessness. People could understand a robbery at a store. They could understand a personal argument that turned violent. They could understand a crime between people who knew each other. But this was different. This attacker seemed to choose strangers. There was no warning. No argument. No connection between victim and attacker. The possibility that anyone could become a target changed the way people lived. Women who once walked home after dark began calling friends for company. Parents became more cautious about where their children went. Neighbors watched unfamiliar cars driving through their streets. A city of more than 1 million people suddenly felt much smaller. Behind this growing nightmare was a man who, on the surface, did not appear to fit the image of a serial offender. Mark Goudeau was not a mysterious stranger hiding in an abandoned building. He was someone who had lived among ordinary people. He had worked construction jobs. He had relationships. He had children. He knew how to talk to people. He knew how to appear normal. And that was one of the most unsettling parts of the case. The person investigators would eventually identify as responsible for a series of brutal crimes was not someone who had spent every day isolated from society. He was someone who could walk through neighborhoods, speak with others, and blend into the background. But behind that ordinary appearance was a history that would later become a central part of the investigation. There were warning signs. There were previous accusations. There were moments that revealed a darker side of his personality. Investigators would later describe a man who displayed controlling behavior and a desire for power over others. The attacks attributed to him showed a disturbing escalation. At first, the crimes involved sexual assaults and robberies. But as time passed, the violence increased. The need to control became more extreme. The consequences became more permanent. And for some victims, there would be no chance to tell their stories. The first reports of the Baseline Killer's attacks arrived in August 2005. At that moment, nobody knew they were witnessing the beginning of a terrifying chapter in Phoenix history. The first victims and investigators did not yet know they were connected to something much larger. Police initially treated incidents separately. A single assault. A single robbery. A single violent encounter. That was how investigations often began. Every crime had its own details. Every victim had their own story. Every location had its own circumstances. But slowly, patterns began appearing. The descriptions started matching. The methods started repeating. The fear started spreading. Investigators realized they were not chasing a single criminal act. They were searching for a person responsible for a series of attacks. The question was no longer simply, who committed this crime? The question became, who has been hunting people across Phoenix? As detectives worked through evidence, they faced an enormous challenge. They were dealing with a criminal who appeared careful. He avoided easy identification. He attacked quickly. He left victims traumatized and investigators searching for answers. Every day without an arrest meant another opportunity for another attack. The pressure grew. The public demanded answers. Families wanted safety. Police knew they were racing against time. And Phoenix was about to experience one of the most intense manhunts in its history. But the baseline killer investigation was not happening in isolation. At the same time, Phoenix was dealing with another terrifying criminal case. A series of random shootings committed by Dale Hausner and Samuel Dietman had also created panic across the city. Two different threats. Two different investigations. Two different groups of victims. For law enforcement, the situation became even more complicated. The city was facing a wave of violence unlike anything it had experienced before. Residents began wondering if Phoenix itself had become unsafe. Was there one criminal behind multiple attacks? Were there several dangerous people operating at the same time? Could police protect ordinary citizens before another person was hurt? Those questions remained unanswered. Meanwhile, the baseline killer continued to move through the city. Every attack added another piece to the puzzle. Every victim carried a story of survival, pain, or loss. Behind the headlines were real people. Mothers. Daughters. Neighbors. Friends. Their lives were changed forever by someone who viewed them not as human beings, but as opportunities. And while the public searched for a face behind the crimes, Mark Goudeau continued living his life. A man who appeared ordinary. A man who did not yet have a name attached to the fear spreading across Phoenix. But investigators were getting closer. Evidence was accumulating. And eventually, science, persistence, and the courage of survivors would begin to expose the truth. The shadow moving through Phoenix was not invisible. It had left traces. And those traces would lead police directly to the man who would become known as the baseline killer. This is the story of how a city was trapped by fear, how investigators hunted a predator hidden in plain sight, and how the victims of one of Arizona's darkest crime sprees finally received justice. Before the name Mark Goudeau became associated with terror, Phoenix was a city that represented growth, opportunity, and the promise of a new beginning. For many people, Phoenix was a place where the past could be left behind. The city sat in the heart of the Sonoran Desert, surrounded by mountains that formed a natural border around a landscape of endless sky and dry, golden earth. During the day, the Arizona sun dominated everything. The streets shimmered with heat. The sidewalks radiated warmth. The desert seemed almost peaceful in its harsh beauty. But Phoenix was also a city of contrasts. Behind the modern buildings, busy highways, and expanding neighborhoods was a place where millions of people lived very different lives. Some residents enjoyed quiet suburban communities with tree-lined streets and family homes. Others lived in older neighborhoods where economic struggles, crime, and social problems were part of everyday reality. By 2005, Phoenix had become one of the fastest-growing cities in the United States. People from across America and from different parts of the world were arriving every year. The population was expanding rapidly. New developments were appearing across the desert. The city was constantly changing. But growth also brought challenges. A larger population meant more traffic, more crowded neighborhoods, and more difficulties for law enforcement trying to keep up with the changing environment. Phoenix was a city where millions of people could move through the streets every day without knowing their neighbors. And for someone looking to disappear among ordinary people, that anonymity could become a powerful advantage. The southern areas of Phoenix, particularly around Baseline Road, were places where communities mixed together. Residential neighborhoods existed alongside commercial areas, empty lots, apartment complexes, and busy roads. Baseline Road itself stretched across a large part of the city. During the day, it was just another route used by commuters, workers, and families. People drove along it without thinking twice. They stopped at stores. They went to work. They picked up their children. They lived their normal lives. Nobody imagined that this same name would later become connected to some of the most frightening crimes Arizona had ever seen. The beginning of the nightmare was not dramatic. There was no single moment when the city suddenly realized it was under attack. Fear arrived slowly. It entered through conversations, through news reports, through police announcements, through the expressions on people's faces when they realized something unusual was happening. At first, residents believed the attacks were isolated. A dangerous person had committed one crime. Perhaps another criminal had committed another. Phoenix was a large city. Crime happened every day. That was the uncomfortable reality of any major American city. But then another attack occurred. Then another. The similarities became harder to ignore. Investigators began noticing details that suggested the same person might be responsible. The victims were often attacked in vulnerable moments. The locations were similar. The methods showed disturbing consistency. The attacker seemed comfortable operating in darkness. He understood timing. He understood opportunity. He understood how quickly fear could spread. And as detectives began connecting the cases, the people of Phoenix unknowingly entered a new reality. The city was no longer simply dealing with crime. It was facing the possibility of a serial predator. In criminal investigations, identifying a pattern is often the first step toward catching an offender. But for the public, discovering a pattern creates another emotion. Fear. A single crime can feel distant. A series of connected crimes feels personal. It creates the feeling that danger is not somewhere else. It is nearby. It could be on the same street. It could be in the same neighborhood. It could happen tomorrow. During this period, many residents began changing small parts of their daily routines. A woman who once walked alone after work started waiting until someone could accompany her. People checked their surroundings before entering their vehicles. Parents became more cautious about allowing their children to go places alone. Simple actions that had once required no thought suddenly carried a sense of risk. The city's relationship with nighttime changed. Darkness became associated with uncertainty. The streets that had once represented freedom became places where people wondered who might be watching. For law enforcement, the pressure was enormous. Police departments regularly investigate violent crimes, but cases involving an unknown attacker who repeatedly targets strangers create unique challenges. There is no obvious motive. No personal connection. No angry family member or business partner pointing investigators toward a suspect. the attacker exists outside the normal relationships that often help solve crimes. Detectives had to begin with fragments. A description from a survivor. A piece of physical evidence. A location. A timeline. A memory. Each piece was important. Each piece could become the link that identified the person responsible. But until that happened, investigators faced a terrifying possibility. The person they were searching for was still free. One of the most difficult aspects of the baseline killer investigation was understanding the mind of the offender. Why these victims? Why these locations? Why this method? Serial offenders often create patterns, even when they appear unpredictable. Their choices reveal something about their thinking. Their crimes show what they value. In the case of the baseline killer, investigators would later conclude that control was a major part of the attacks. The crimes were not simply about taking property. They were about domination. The victims were placed in situations where the attacker had complete power over them. For survivors, the physical injuries were only one part of the damage. The psychological impact lasted much longer. Many survivors would carry the memory of those moments for the rest of their lives. The fear. The confusion. The feeling of helplessness. While investigators worked behind the scenes, the public only saw pieces of the story. News reports described attacks. Police asked for information. Authorities warned residents to remain cautious. But behind every announcement was a much larger investigation. Hundreds of officers, detectives, and specialists were trying to answer one question. Who was doing this? The investigation became a race against time. Because with every passing day, the possibility remained that another victim could be added to the list. Then came another devastating realization. The person responsible was not necessarily someone hiding far away. He could be living nearby. He could be someone people passed on the street. Someone who went to stores. Someone who had conversations with neighbors. Someone who looked ordinary. That possibility was one of the most disturbing elements of the case. The baseline killer did not appear like a monster from a horror story. He appeared human. And that made him even more frightening. As 2005 moved toward 2006, Phoenix found itself caught between two realities. During the day, it remained the same growing American city. People went to work. Children went to school. Businesses operated. Life continued. But beneath that normal surface was a growing anxiety. The city was waiting. Waiting for answers. Waiting for an arrest. Waiting for someone to explain why innocent people had become targets. The name baseline killer became more than a label used by newspapers. It became a symbol of uncertainty. A reminder that evil could exist in ordinary places. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person is not the stranger everyone fears. Sometimes it is the person nobody notices. And while Phoenix searched for the truth, Mark Goudeau remained hidden in plain sight. The man who would eventually be connected to one of the most horrifying crime sprees in Arizona history was still walking freely among the same streets where fear was growing. The city did not know his face. It did not know his name. But soon, everything would change. Because the investigation was only beginning. And the stories of the victims would soon reveal the full horror of the baseline killer. When a serial killer's name appears in newspapers and television reports, the focus often shifts toward the person responsible. The investigation. The evidence. The chase. The courtroom. The punishment. But before there was a killer, before there was a suspect, before there was a trial, there were people whose lives mattered. They were not just names in a police file. They were mothers, daughters, friends, neighbors, and members of a community. They had memories. They had dreams. They had ordinary moments that they expected would continue for years. The tragedy of the baseline killer case was not only that lives were taken. It was that the victims were turned into chapters of a criminal investigation instead of being remembered for who they truly were. Behind every crime scene photograph was a human story. Behind every police report was a family waiting for answers. Behind every headline was a person who deserved to be remembered beyond the violence that ended their life. The baseline killer's victims came from different backgrounds. They were not connected by friendships, family relationships, or shared experiences. Their only connection was that, at a certain moment, they crossed paths with someone who had chosen violence. That randomness was part of what made the crimes so terrifying. There was no personal conflict to explain the attacks. No warning. No obvious reason. The victims were selected because they were vulnerable. Because they were available. Because the attacker believed he could control the situation. For families left behind, that reality was almost impossible to accept. How could someone they loved become a target of a stranger? How could an ordinary day become the final moment of a life? Those questions would remain long after the investigation ended. One of the victims whose name became permanently connected to the baseline killer investigation was Deanna Beaudoin. Deanna was not someone who lived a life defined by fear. Those who knew her described a woman with her own personality, her own routines, and her own place in the lives of the people around her. Like many people, she had everyday concerns. Bills. Responsibilities. Relationships. Plans for the future. Nothing about her life suggested that she would become part of one of Arizona's most disturbing criminal cases. But in December 2005, everything changed. Deanna was found dead inside her home in Phoenix. The discovery immediately raised serious questions. The scene suggested that this was not a random accident. Investigators recognized signs of a violent crime. The details pointed toward a pattern that was beginning to emerge across the city. A woman attacked in her own space. A place where people are supposed to feel safest. A home that should represent protection had become the location of a devastating crime. For Deanna's family and friends, the loss was not only about death. It was about the violation of a place that should have been private and secure. The person responsible had entered a world that belonged to her. He had taken away the safety that everyone assumes they have inside their own home. But perhaps the most important thing left behind at Deanna's crime scene was not only evidence of what happened. It was evidence that could eventually help reveal who was responsible. Investigators recovered DNA evidence that would later become a major part of the case against Mark Goudeau. At the time, however, it was only a piece of the puzzle. A small piece. A clue waiting for technology and investigation to reveal its importance. Another victim connected to the baseline killer investigation was Georgia Thompson. Georgia represented another devastating aspect of the case. She was older, someone who should have been living a quieter stage of life. Many people imagine violent crime happening between people involved in dangerous situations. But the baseline killer shattered that assumption. Age did not protect someone. A peaceful lifestyle did not protect someone. Simply being at home did not guarantee safety. For Georgia's loved ones, the pain came not only from losing her but from understanding the cruelty involved. A person who had spent decades building memories could suddenly have everything taken away. A family could go from ordinary conversations to funeral arrangements. A familiar voice could become a memory. A familiar face could become a photograph. That was the human cost of the investigation. Each victim represented a world that disappeared. Another victim associated with the case was Carmen Miranda. Her death added another layer of fear because it showed the increasing violence of the attacker. The crimes were not remaining at the level of robbery or assault. The danger was escalating. Investigators were beginning to understand that they were not dealing with someone who simply wanted property. They were dealing with someone willing to take lives. For the public, this realization changed everything. A thief can be avoided. A person committing random violence is much harder to predict. The fear came from the unknown. People began asking, how many victims were there? How long had this person been doing this? Would he attack again? The answers were frightening. Because the investigation suggested that the killer had already developed confidence. He had learned from previous attacks. He had become more comfortable. And each successful crime increased the danger. Among the victims was also Elfriede Goff, whose death represented another painful reminder that the killer did not follow the boundaries people expect criminals to follow. There was no single type of victim. There was no simple explanation. The victims were individuals who happened to become exposed to a dangerous person at a moment when they could not protect themselves. For investigators, understanding the victims was important because victims often reveal information about offenders. Their routines. Their locations. The circumstances around their final moments. Every detail mattered. The way a person was approached. The way a crime was carried out. The evidence left behind. All of it helped investigators build a picture of the person they were hunting. But for families, the investigation was much more personal. They were not looking at evidence. They were grieving. They were trying to understand how someone could commit such acts. They were trying to imagine a future without someone they loved. In many criminal cases, the victims become overshadowed by the offender. The public becomes fascinated by the killer's personality. The investigation. The trial. The media coverage. But the true center of the story should always remain the people who suffered. The baseline killer case was not simply about Mark Goudeau. It was about the lives interrupted by his actions. It was about families who lost someone forever. It was about survivors who carried memories they never wanted. It was about a city forced to confront the reality that ordinary people could become victims of extraordinary violence. The survivors of the attacks also played a crucial role. Their courage became one of the strongest elements of the investigation. Some had experienced moments of unimaginable fear but still found the strength to speak. They provided descriptions. They answered difficult questions. They helped police understand the attacker's behavior. Without survivors willing to tell their stories, the investigation might have taken a very different path. Their voices became evidence. Their memories became clues. Their courage became part of the effort to stop the person responsible. As detectives continued connecting cases throughout 2005 and 2006, the victims slowly revealed the pattern of the man hunting them. The baseline killer was not choosing people because of who they were. He was choosing moments when he believed he could overpower them. That distinction was important, because it showed investigators something about his mindset. This was not a crime of passion. It was not an emotional explosion. It was calculated. The attacker was looking for control. An understanding that would become essential in the search for him. Phoenix had begun with fear. But behind that fear were real people whose stories deserved attention. People who laughed. People who loved. People who had plans. People who should have had more time. Their lives became the reason investigators refused to stop. Their memories became the motivation behind the largest criminal investigation Arizona had ever seen. And as police continued searching for the person responsible, they knew one thing. Every day that passed without an arrest was another day that families waited for justice. Every unanswered question represented another wound. Every unsolved attack represented another threat. The city was searching for a killer. But before that killer could be found, investigators first had to understand the people he had taken from the world. Because the road to justice would begin with the victims, the first attacks connected to the baseline killer did not begin with a dramatic moment that immediately revealed the presence of a serial predator. There was no single night when Phoenix suddenly understood that it was facing a monster. Instead, the nightmare arrived quietly. It began with one victim. One location. One terrifying encounter. And then another. At the beginning, these crimes existed as separate tragedies. To the victims, their families, and even to many investigators, they appeared to be isolated acts of violence committed by someone unknown. But hidden beneath those individual incidents was a pattern slowly taking shape. A pattern that would eventually reveal the presence of a man who was not acting randomly. He was hunting. In August 2005, Phoenix was still moving through the final weeks of summer. The temperatures remained intense, the desert heat lingering into the evening hours. After sunset, the streets became quieter, but the city never truly slept. People continued their routines. Workers returned home after long shifts. Families gathered for dinner. Neighbors walked through their communities. Life continued as normal. Until someone decided to interrupt that normality with violence. The first attacks attributed to Mark Goudeau showed investigators the beginning of a disturbing method. The attacker approached victims unexpectedly. There was no warning. No opportunity for negotiation. The victim suddenly found herself facing a stranger who had turned an ordinary moment into a terrifying struggle for survival. The attacker used intimidation and force. He controlled the situation through fear. His objective was not only to take property. It was to dominate. The psychological damage inflicted during these attacks would become one of the most painful parts of the victim's experiences. For survivors, the memory was not limited to what happened physically. It was the feeling of being trapped. The realization that another person had decided they no longer had control over their own safety. That feeling stayed long after the attacker disappeared. At first, investigators approached each report carefully but separately. This was normal police procedure. Every crime had to be examined based on the evidence available. Every victim deserved a complete investigation. Every possibility had to be considered. Was it a local criminal? Was it someone passing through Phoenix? Was it someone connected to the victim? Could there be another explanation? In the early stages, investigators did not immediately know they were searching for a serial offender. But as more reports came in, similarities became impossible to ignore. The victims described a similar experience. A sudden attack. A threatening presence. A man who seemed prepared. A person who knew how to create fear quickly. The crimes were not chaotic. They had a disturbing structure. The attacker appeared to understand what he wanted and how to achieve it. That realization changed the direction of the investigation. Police were no longer searching for someone responsible for one crime. They were searching for someone who had committed multiple crimes and might continue. The danger was not over. It was growing. As investigators reviewed the cases, they began noticing another frightening element. The attacker seemed comfortable moving through different areas of Phoenix. He was not limited to one neighborhood. He could appear in places where people believed they were safe. Residential areas. Parking lots. Quiet streets. Places where ordinary people expected nothing unusual to happen. This mobility made him harder to predict. A criminal who follows a strict routine leaves behind patterns that police can exploit. But someone who appears to choose opportunities based on circumstances creates a much more difficult challenge. The baseline killer seemed to search for moments of vulnerability. A person walking alone. Someone separated from others. A location with limited witnesses. The crime suggested patience. He was not simply reacting. He was observing. He was waiting. And that was one of the details that deeply disturbed investigators. The attacker did not appear to lose control during these incidents. Instead, he appeared to seek control. As the attacks continued, the level of violence increased. What began as assaults and robberies eventually became something far worse. Some victims did not survive. For families receiving devastating news, the reality was impossible to comprehend. A person they loved had left home one day and never returned. A phone call from authorities changed everything. A name that once represented a person's entire life became connected to a criminal investigation. A photograph became a memory. A future disappeared. The deaths of victims such as Georgia Thompson, Carmen Miranda, Deanna Bodewing, Alfreda Goff, and Kimberly Hamilton revealed the darkest side of the investigation. These were not accidents. These were deliberate acts. Someone had made the decision to end another person's life. And investigators needed to understand why. In criminal psychology, escalation is often one of the most important warning signs. Some offenders begin with one type of crime and gradually become more violent as they gain confidence. The baseline killer appeared to follow this frightening progression. The attacks became more severe. The risks increased. The consequences became permanent. Every successful attack may have reinforced the offender's belief that he could continue. Every time he avoided capture, he became more confident. And confidence in a violent offender can become extremely dangerous. Meanwhile, Phoenix residents were slowly realizing that something unusual was happening. People began sharing information. News reports became more frequent. Police warnings became more urgent. The phrase, baseline killer, began appearing across the city. A name had been created. But the person behind the name remained unknown. The public knew the crimes. They knew the fear. They knew the stories. But they did not know the face. That uncertainty created a special kind of anxiety. A known criminal can be avoided. An unknown criminal can be anywhere. Every stranger became a possibility. Every unfamiliar vehicle created suspicion. Every late-night walk required more caution. The emotional impact spread beyond the direct victims. A criminal investigation had become a community experience. Phoenix was no longer simply reading about crimes. It was living through them. And while residents searched for ways to protect themselves, investigators worked through thousands of pieces of information. They collected evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They studied crime scenes. They compared details. They searched for the connection that would reveal the identity of the person responsible. But the baseline killer investigation faced a major obstacle. The attacker had left behind fear. But fear alone could not identify him. Police needed something stronger. Something scientific. Something that could place a specific person at a specific crime scene. They needed evidence that could survive in court. They needed proof. And eventually, the smallest traces left behind during these attacks would become the key to finding the man responsible. But before that breakthrough could happen, investigators had to endure months of uncertainty. Months of searching. Months of wondering whether another victim would be added. Because somewhere in Phoenix, the baseline killer was still free. And the city was waiting for the next attack. The next clue. The next mistake. The next opportunity to finally stop him. The nightmare had begun. And nobody yet knew how long it would last. Every criminal investigation begins with a moment when the unknown becomes real. A phone call. A discovery. A door opened into a place where something terrible has happened. For the investigators assigned to the baseline killer case, those moments came again and again throughout 2005 and 2006. Each crime scene was a silent witness. The rooms, streets, and locations where victims were found could not speak, but they carried evidence. A position of an object. A mark left behind. A trace that seemed insignificant at first. A small detail that might eventually reveal the identity of the person responsible. For detectives, the crime scene was where the story began. But unlike a normal story, this one had missing pages. They had to reconstruct what happened from fragments. Who was there? What happened first? How did the attacker enter? How did the victim respond? How did the offender leave without being caught? Every question mattered. Every second mattered. Because somewhere inside those scenes was the truth. The investigation into the baseline killer became one of the most intense forensic efforts in Arizona history. The crimes were frightening not only because of their violence but because of the uncertainty surrounding them. At the beginning, police did not know exactly who they were looking for. They did not know his name. They did not know where he lived. They did not know how close he might be to their investigation. They only knew that a person was committing brutal attacks across Phoenix. And that person was leaving behind clues. The first challenge was recognizing that the cases belonged together. Crime scenes can appear different even when the same person is responsible. Different locations. Different victims. Different circumstances. But experienced investigators know that offenders often leave behind patterns. The same behavior. The same choices. The same mistakes. As detectives examined the baseline cases, similarities began to emerge. The attacks often happened in places where victims were vulnerable. The offender appeared comfortable approaching strangers. He seemed able to move quickly, control the situation, and disappear. But every criminal, no matter how careful, leaves something behind. Sometimes it is obvious. Sometimes it is invisible until technology catches up. In this case, one of the most important pieces of evidence would come from forensic science. DNA. At the time, DNA technology was already transforming criminal investigations across the United States. A microscopic biological trace could connect a person to a crime scene years after the event occurred. A piece of evidence too small to see could become stronger than any witness. For the investigators working the baseline killer case, DNA represented something extremely valuable. A connection. A way to move from uncertainty toward a name. But before that connection could be made, investigators first had to collect and preserve evidence from multiple crime scenes. Every location required careful examination. Detectives photographed scenes from multiple angles. Crime scene specialists documented details. Evidence technicians collected possible biological material. Nothing could be ignored. A single mistake could damage an investigation. A single overlooked item could become the difference between justice and failure. The pressure was enormous. Because behind every piece of evidence was a victim and a family waiting for answers. One of the most significant crime scenes involved Deanna Beaudoin. When investigators entered her home, they were not simply examining a location. They were entering the final moments of someone's life. The home represented something deeply personal. It contained memories. Daily routines. Signs of the person who lived there. But now it had become a crime scene. For investigators, this created an emotional challenge. They had to remain focused. They had to separate emotion from procedure. They needed to search for facts. Every detail had meaning. The location of evidence. The condition of the scene. The timeline. The possible movements of the attacker. The crime scene became a puzzle. A puzzle with a victim's life at the center. As the investigation expanded, detectives began comparing evidence from different attacks. They looked for similarities. They examined witness descriptions. They studied the offender's behavior. They asked whether the same person could have committed multiple crimes. The answer became increasingly clear. The crimes were connected. The baseline killer was not a rumor. He was real. And he had been active for months. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the attacker's ability to avoid identification. The public imagined a criminal who would stand out. Someone obviously dangerous. Someone who looked different from everyone else. But many violent offenders do not appear that way. They can have jobs, relationships, families. They can interact with people every day while hiding their actions. That reality made the investigation more difficult. Police were not searching for a person who looked like a criminal. They were searching for someone who could appear completely ordinary. Meanwhile, the number of attacks increased pressure on investigators. The public wanted immediate answers. Families wanted justice. Officials faced questions about whether enough was being done. Behind the scenes, law enforcement agencies increased cooperation. The Baseline Killer Task Force brought together investigators from different units. The goal was simple. Find him before he could hurt anyone else. Detectives reviewed hundreds of tips. Some were useful. Some were wrong. Some came from frightened residents who believed they had seen something suspicious. In major investigations, information can become both a weapon and a challenge. Too little information makes solving a case impossible. Too much information can make finding the truth more difficult. Investigators had to separate facts from speculation. They had to follow evidence, not fear. And slowly, the evidence began pointing toward a clearer picture. The attacker was likely someone familiar with the Phoenix area. Someone comfortable traveling through the city. Someone who understood where and when to strike. Someone who had experience avoiding attention. This profile began narrowing the search. But investigators still needed a breakthrough. They needed a name. They needed a suspect. They needed something that could turn suspicion into proof. That moment would eventually come through the combination of forensic evidence and careful police work. The DNA collected from crime scenes became the thread connecting the attacks. It was a silent witness. It had no emotion. No memory. No fear. But it carried information. Information that would eventually lead investigators toward Mark Goudeau. Before that happened, however, police had to overcome another major obstacle. They had to determine whether the man connected to the evidence was truly the person responsible. Because in a case involving multiple murders and serious crimes, suspicion was not enough. The evidence had to withstand questioning. It had to survive court. It had to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The investigation was approaching a turning point. The invisible traces left behind at crime scenes were beginning to speak. The victims who could no longer tell their stories were leaving behind evidence that could. And after months of fear, uncertainty, and unanswered questions, investigators were finally moving closer to the person hiding behind the name Baseline Killer. The shadow that had haunted Phoenix was beginning to take shape. And soon, the city would finally learn the face behind the fear. For the investigators assigned to the Baseline Killer case, every morning began with the same uncomfortable reality. The person they were searching for was still out there. While detectives studied evidence, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed reports, the offender had something they could not afford to give him. Time. Time allowed him to disappear into ordinary life. Time allowed him to plan. Time allowed him to strike again. And every day without an arrest meant that another victim could potentially be added to the growing list. the investigation became a race between two forces. On one side was law enforcement, using every resource available to identify a hidden predator. On the other side was a criminal who had already shown that he could attack strangers, create fear, and vanish before anyone could stop him. The pressure on investigators was enormous. Phoenix was demanding answers. Families wanted justice. Residents wanted safety. And police knew that failure could mean another tragedy. The first challenge was understanding exactly who they were looking for. Serial offenders often leave behind clues through their behavior. The way they choose victims. The way they approach them. The locations they select. The risks they take. The mistakes they make. Investigators began studying every detail of the baseline killer cases. They compared reports from different victims. They reviewed statements. They looked for similarities that could reveal the offender's habits. The goal was to move beyond the crimes themselves and understand the person committing them. What kind of person could commit these attacks? What motivated him? How did he choose his victims? How was he able to continue without being identified? The answers would eventually help build a profile. The attacker appeared to be someone comfortable moving through Phoenix. He knew the environment. He understood the streets. He appeared to know where people were vulnerable and where witnesses were less likely to appear. That suggested familiarity. He was not acting like someone lost in a city he did not understand. He seemed connected to the area. Someone who belonged there. Someone who could disappear into the same neighborhoods he terrorized. This possibility created a disturbing thought for investigators. The person they were searching for might not be a stranger passing through. He might be someone living among them. Someone going to work. Someone shopping at the same stores. Someone standing in line beside other people who had no idea what he had done. That possibility was one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The investigation expanded rapidly. The Baseline Killer Task Force became a major operation involving detectives, forensic specialists, analysts, and officers working together. Thousands of hours were spent reviewing information. Every report had to be examined. Every possible connection had to be considered. Every person of interest had to be evaluated. But major investigations often come with another problem. Not every lead is useful. When fear spreads through a community, people begin seeing danger everywhere. Police received numerous tips. Some came from witnesses who genuinely wanted to help. Others came from people who believed they recognized suspicious behavior. Investigators had to carefully separate valuable information from false leads. A single wrong direction could waste critical time. The public wanted immediate results, but detectives understood that rushing could destroy the case. They were not searching for someone to blame. They were searching for the truth. One of the most difficult parts of the investigation was the uncertainty surrounding the offender's identity. The Baseline Killer did not leave behind an obvious trail. There was no direct connection between him and his victims. No relationship. No personal history. No angry confrontation that led to violence. This was a stranger crime. And stranger crimes are among the most difficult for investigators because the normal paths of investigation are missing. In many murder cases, police begin with the victim's personal life. Friends. Family. Enemies. Relationships. But in the Baseline Killer investigation, detectives had to begin somewhere else. They had to study the offender. They had to reconstruct his behavior. They had to understand the person behind the attacks. As investigators continued working, another complication appeared. Phoenix was dealing with another terrifying criminal case at the same time. The city was also experiencing a series of random shootings linked to Dale Hausner and Samuel Dietman, known as the Phoenix serial shooters. For residents, it felt as if the city was facing multiple threats simultaneously. People were afraid to be outside at night. News reports brought new stories of violence. The public wondered if these crimes were connected. Could there be one person responsible for multiple types of attacks? Were several dangerous criminals operating at the same time? For investigators, separating these cases became extremely important. The baseline killer and the serial shooters represented different patterns of behavior. Different methods. Different types of offenders. But during a period of intense fear, every violent crime seemed connected in the minds of many residents. The confusion increased the pressure on police. They had to solve not only the crimes but also the fear surrounding them. Meanwhile, detectives continued examining evidence connected to the baseline killer attacks. One area of focus was the descriptions provided by survivors. Victims who survived violent crimes often provide some of the most valuable information investigators can obtain. They can describe the attacker's appearance, his voice, his behavior, his movements, his words. Even small details can become important. A phrase spoken during an attack, a physical characteristic, a unique habit. All of these pieces can help investigators create a picture of the offender. The survivors of the baseline killer attacks showed remarkable courage. They had experienced moments that many people cannot imagine. Yet they still worked with investigators. They answered questions. They revisited painful memories. They helped create a timeline of the attacker's actions. Their voices became essential parts of the investigation. As police continued searching, they also examined individuals with criminal histories. They looked for people who matched the behavior pattern. People with previous violent offenses. People with records involving sexual crimes. People who might have the ability and opportunity to commit the attacks. This process eventually brought attention to Mark Goudeau. At the time, he was not known publicly as the baseline killer. He was simply one person among many who investigators needed to examine. But as detectives looked deeper, certain details began standing out. Goudeau had a history that raised concerns. He had previous legal problems. He had a background involving allegations of violence and sexual misconduct. And his connection to the evidence would eventually become one of the most important developments in the case. But investigators still had to be careful. A criminal history does not prove responsibility for a new crime. Suspicion is not evidence. A person can appear suspicious and still be innocent. The detectives needed something stronger. They needed proof. They needed a connection that could not be easily explained away. That connection would come from forensic science. The DNA evidence collected from crime scenes became increasingly important. Every sample represented a possibility. Every test represented a chance to move closer to the truth. The technology was powerful, but it required patience. DNA does not tell investigators everything immediately. It must be analyzed, compared, verified. The process takes time. But when the results finally arrive, they can change everything. For the baseline killer investigation, that moment would become the turning point. After months of fear, uncertainty, and searching, investigators were finally approaching the person behind the crimes. The man who had hidden among ordinary people was about to be exposed. The shadow was becoming a name. The name was becoming a suspect. And soon, Phoenix would discover that the person responsible for its darkest nightmare was not someone who had been hiding far away. He had been much closer than anyone imagined. The hunt was almost over. But the fight for justice was only beginning. The evidence that spoke, how DNA led investigators to Mark Goudeau. For more than a year, Phoenix lived under the shadow of uncertainty. The attacks had created fear. The victims had left behind painful memories. Investigators had followed hundreds of leads. But the most important question remained unanswered. Who was the person behind the name Baseline Killer? For detectives, the case was a battle between time and evidence. They knew the offender was intelligent enough to avoid immediate capture. They knew he was comfortable moving through the city. They knew he had attacked multiple people and had become increasingly violent. But knowing the behavior of a criminal was not enough. They needed his identity. They needed something that could stand in a courtroom. Something stronger than suspicion. Something stronger than a theory. They needed a connection. And that connection would come from the smallest traces left behind. DNA. In modern criminal investigations, DNA evidence can become the silent witness that never forgets. A person can deny being somewhere. A person can change a story. A person can claim innocence. But biological evidence can tell a different story. It can reveal where someone was. It can connect an individual to a victim. It can expose a truth that words cannot hide. For the investigators working the Baseline Killer case, DNA became the key that began unlocking the mystery. The evidence collected from crime scenes had been carefully preserved and analyzed. Every sample was treated as potentially important. Every result was examined. The process required patience because the investigators understood the importance of accuracy. This was not a case where they could afford mistakes. A wrong accusation would not only damage the investigation, it would also fail the victims and their families. The person responsible had to be identified correctly. The evidence had to be undeniable. As forensic testing continued, investigators discovered connections between crime scene evidence and Mark Goudeau. At first, Goudeau was not a name known to the public. He was not the person everyone imagined when they thought about the Baseline Killer. That was part of what made the case so disturbing. The person investigators were beginning to focus on did not fit the image many people had created in their minds. He was not a mysterious figure hiding in isolation. He was someone who had lived a relatively ordinary public life. He had worked. He had interacted with people. He had relationships. He had managed to move through society while investigators searched for a violent offender. But the evidence was beginning to tell a different story. The investigation into Goudeau became more detailed. Detectives examined his background. They reviewed his history. They looked at his previous encounters with law enforcement. They studied whether his behavior matched the pattern established in the Baseline Killer crimes. The more investigators looked, the more concerning the picture became. Goudeau had a history that included accusations of violence and sexual offenses. Those details did not prove he was responsible for the Baseline crimes. But they gave investigators reason to look closer. A criminal investigation is built piece by piece. A single piece rarely solves everything. Instead, investigators create a larger picture. One piece may suggest a possibility. Another may strengthen it. Another may eliminate doubt. In the Baseline Killer case, DNA was the foundation. But investigators also relied on witness statements and behavioral patterns. Survivors had provided descriptions of their attacker. They had remembered details from moments of extreme fear. Their accounts helped investigators compare the known crimes with the person they were investigating. The similarities became increasingly difficult to ignore. The attacker's methods. The locations. The timing. The behavior. The evidence was forming a consistent picture. Meanwhile, investigators began quietly monitoring Goudeau. Before making an arrest in a case of this magnitude, police needed confidence. This was not just one crime. This involved multiple victims. Multiple families. a city that had been waiting for answers. The arrest had to be built on evidence strong enough to survive intense legal examination. Every step mattered. Every decision mattered. Because once police moved against a suspect, the entire case would be examined under a microscope. The defense would challenge every piece of evidence. The prosecution would have to prove every connection. There would be no room for uncertainty. On September 6, 2006, after months of investigation, Phoenix police arrested Mark Goudeau. The man accused of terrorizing the city was finally in custody. For many residents, the arrest brought a mixture of emotions. Relief. Anger. Sadness. But perhaps the strongest feeling was uncertainty. Even after an arrest, many questions remained. Was this truly the man responsible? Would the evidence hold up? Would the victims finally receive justice? The arrest did not end the story. It began a new chapter. The investigation moved from the streets of Phoenix into courtrooms and legal proceedings. Now prosecutors had to transform evidence into a case. They had to explain to a jury how a series of crimes committed over more than a year were connected to one man. They had to present the stories of victims. They had to show the impact of the crimes. They had to prove that the evidence was not a coincidence. For Mark Goudeau, the situation was completely different. He went from living a private life to becoming one of the most recognized criminal suspects in Arizona. His face appeared in news reports. His name became associated with fear. But he maintained his innocence. Goudeau claimed that he was being wrongly accused. He argued that investigators had focused on him because they needed someone to blame. He questioned the evidence. He denied responsibility. This became the central battle that would define the upcoming trial. The prosecution believed the evidence told a clear story. The defense argued that the story had been misunderstood. Between those two positions stood the people who would decide the truth. A jury. Before that happened, however, investigators continued building their case. They reviewed every detail. They prepared every piece of evidence. They organized years of work into a presentation that could explain the investigation to 12 strangers. The challenge was enormous. Because a serial crime investigation is not just about proving what happened. It is about proving who did it. The prosecution would need to show that Mark Goudeau was not simply connected to one event. He was connected to a pattern. A pattern involving violence, fear, and loss. The DNA evidence had opened the door. But now investigators and prosecutors had to walk through it. They had to tell the complete story. The story of a city under attack. The story of victims whose lives were forever changed. The story of a man who appeared ordinary while hiding accusations of extraordinary violence. The arrest of Mark Goudeau marked the end of the search. But it was only the beginning of the fight for justice. Because in a case this serious, an arrest is not the final answer. It is only the moment when the questions move from the streets into the courtroom. And there, under the eyes of a jury, the evidence would finally be tested. For the people of Phoenix, the arrest of Mark Goudeau brought something they had not felt for more than a year. A sense that the nightmare might finally have an ending. But an arrest was not the same as justice. A suspect in custody was not the same as accountability. The families of the victims had waited through months of uncertainty, fear, and unanswered questions. They had watched investigators chase leads. They had heard theories. They had lived with the painful reality that the person responsible for their suffering was still somewhere in the world. Now, they would have to wait again. This time, they would wait for a courtroom to decide the truth. The trial of Mark Goudeau would become one of the most significant criminal proceedings in Arizona history. It was not simply about one man accused of crimes. It was about a city trying to understand how such violence had happened in its own neighborhoods. It was about victims whose lives had been interrupted. It was about survivors who had to return to painful memories and describe moments they wished they could forget. And it was about whether the evidence collected over years of investigation was strong enough to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. When the trial began, prosecutors faced an enormous responsibility. They were not presenting a single crime. They were presenting a pattern. A series of attacks. A timeline of violence. A connection between separate victims and one accused offender. The prosecution's case depended heavily on forensic evidence. The DNA evidence was the center of the investigation. It was the thread connecting Mark Goudeau to the crimes. For prosecutors, DNA represented something powerful. It was not based on emotion. It was not based on public fear. It was scientific evidence. A biological connection that placed Goudeau in the story of the crimes. But prosecutors knew that evidence alone would not tell the entire story. A jury needed to understand the human side of the case. They needed to see the victims as people. Not numbers. Not names on a list. Not simply evidence in a criminal trial. The prosecution presented the experiences of survivors who had encountered the baseline killer and lived to tell their stories. For these survivors, stepping into the courtroom was another battle. They had already endured unimaginable moments. They had already faced the person who attacked them. Now they had to sit in front of strangers and describe what happened. They had to reopen memories filled with fear. They had to answer questions about moments of vulnerability. They had to remember details from experiences their minds had tried to escape. But their testimony became one of the strongest parts of the case. They gave a voice to the investigation. They showed the jury the reality behind the evidence. They demonstrated that these crimes were not just events recorded in police files. They happened to real people. People who suffered. People who survived. People who deserved justice. The prosecution also presented evidence showing similarities between the crimes. They argued that the attacks were not separate incidents committed by unrelated people. They were connected. The same type of behavior appeared repeatedly. The same pattern of control. The same method of approaching vulnerable victims. The same escalating violence. The message from prosecutors was clear. This was not coincidence. This was a pattern. And Mark Goudeau was the person responsible. But the defense presented a different story. From the beginning, Goudeau maintained his innocence. He insisted he was not the baseline killer. His attorneys argued that the evidence had been misunderstood. They questioned the investigation. They challenged the reliability of witnesses. They attempted to create doubt in the minds of jurors. In a criminal trial, the defense does not need to prove who committed the crime. It only needs to create reasonable doubt. The attorneys representing Goudeau focused on weaknesses they believed existed in the prosecution's case. They questioned whether investigators had considered other possibilities. They argued that suspicion had influenced the investigation. They suggested that authorities, under enormous public pressure, had focused too heavily on one person. The courtroom became a battlefield of competing narratives. One side presented Mark Goudeau as a violent predator who had terrorized Phoenix. The other presented him as a man wrongly accused by a system desperate for answers. The jury had to decide which story matched the evidence. Throughout the trial, the emotional weight of the case remained impossible to ignore. Families of victims sat in the courtroom listening to details about the people they had lost. For them, the trial was not an abstract legal process. It was personal. Every piece of evidence represented a painful reminder. Every photograph. Every testimony. Every description. Behind the legal arguments were empty chairs at family gatherings. Missing voices. Memories of people who would never return. The courtroom also revealed the complexity of criminal investigations. Even when the evidence appears strong, justice requires careful examination. The responsibility of a jury is enormous. They are not deciding whether a person is frightening. They are deciding whether the evidence proves guilt. They must separate emotion from fact, fear from proof, suspicion from certainty. As the trial continued, prosecutors repeatedly returned to the same central argument. The evidence was not based on one detail. It was based on many details that came together. DNA, witness accounts, crime patterns, the history of the investigation, the connection between multiple incidents. Together, prosecutors argued, these pieces formed a complete picture. The defense continued challenging the prosecution's interpretation. But after weeks of testimony, evidence, and arguments, the case moved toward its final stage. The jury left to consider the evidence. For the families, this was another moment of waiting. Waiting for a decision. Waiting to hear whether the person accused of destroying their lives would be held responsible. Waiting for a conclusion after years of pain. The jury eventually returned with its decision. Mark Goudeau was found guilty of numerous charges connected to the baseline killer attacks. For many in Phoenix, the verdict represented a moment they had been waiting for since the first reports of violence appeared. The man accused of spreading fear across their city had been held accountable. But the case was not finished. Because in Arizona, crimes of this severity required another decision. The punishment. The same courtroom that had examined the evidence would now decide whether Mark Goudeau would spend the rest of his life in prison or face the ultimate penalty. The sentencing phase would focus on the severity of his crimes, the number of victims, the suffering caused, the lasting impact on families and the community. Prosecutors argued that the brutality and scale of the crimes placed Goudeau among the most dangerous offenders in Arizona history. The defense continued fighting for his life. But after considering the evidence and the circumstances surrounding the crimes, the court reached its final decision. In 2011, Mark Goudeau was sentenced to death. The punishment reflected the court's conclusion that the crimes represented an extraordinary level of violence. For the families of victims, the sentence could never restore what had been lost. No verdict could bring back loved ones. No punishment could erase painful memories. But the decision provided something that had been missing for years. A sense that the justice system had recognized their suffering. The baseline killer investigation had begun with fear. It had moved through uncertainty. It had depended on science, persistence, and courage. And it ended with a conviction. But even after the courtroom doors closed, the impact of the case remained. Because the story of the baseline killer was never only about Mark Goudeau. It was about the people whose lives were changed forever. The survivors who found the strength to speak. The families who refused to forget. The investigators who continued searching when answers seemed impossible. And a city that learned one of the hardest lessons in criminal history. Sometimes, the greatest danger is not the person hiding in the shadows. It is the person who can walk through the light unnoticed. The courtroom had delivered its final decision. Mark Goudeau had been convicted. The man prosecutors identified as the baseline killer had been sentenced to death. For many people in Phoenix, the verdict represented the end of a nightmare that had lasted for years. The fear that once followed residents through the streets had finally been replaced by a sense of relief. But for the families of the victims, there was no true ending. There was only a new reality. A reality where justice had been served, but the people they loved were still gone. A conviction could answer the question of who was responsible. It could confirm the truth of what happened. But it could not undo the damage. It could not return a mother to her children. It could not bring back a daughter, a friend, or a neighbor. It could not erase the memories of the victims whose lives ended during one of the darkest periods in Arizona's modern history. The aftermath of the Baseline Killer case revealed something important about violent crime. The end of an investigation is not the end of the story. For law enforcement, the case eventually became a completed investigation. For the courts, it became a final judgment. But for survivors and families, the impact continued. Long after the news cameras disappeared. Long after the courtroom closed. Long after the public moved on to other stories. The pain remained. For survivors of the attacks, the process of rebuilding their lives was complicated. Surviving a violent crime does not mean leaving the experience behind. The physical injuries may heal. The legal process may end. But the psychological impact can remain for years. Many survivors struggle with questions that have no easy answers. Why did this happen to me? Could I have done something differently? Will I ever feel safe again? These questions often follow victims long after the criminal is caught. The Baseline Killer case was especially traumatic because the victims were not involved in dangerous situations. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives. Their experiences created a painful reminder that violence can enter a person's life without warning. For some residents of Phoenix, the arrest and conviction of Mark Goudeau restored a sense of safety. The city slowly began returning to normal. People resumed routines they had changed during the investigation. They walked through neighborhoods. They spent evenings outside. They stopped checking every unfamiliar face with suspicion. But the memory of those years remained. Because cities remember their darkest moments. Certain locations carry stories. Certain names carry emotions. Baseline Road became more than a street. It became a reminder of fear, investigation, and survival. The case also changed the way Phoenix approached major criminal investigations. The Baseline Killer investigation demonstrated the importance of cooperation between different law enforcement departments. Large-scale cases require communication. They require sharing information. They require combining experience from different areas of expertise. The investigation involved detectives, forensic specialists, analysts, and officers who worked through enormous amounts of information. Their work became an example of how modern investigations rely on both traditional police methods and advanced science. Perhaps the most significant lesson from the case was the importance of DNA evidence. Before modern forensic technology, many criminal investigations depended heavily on eyewitness accounts and physical evidence that could be seen. But DNA changed the landscape. A tiny biological trace could connect an offender to a crime scene. It could reveal relationships between separate cases. It could provide answers when memories faded and witnesses were uncertain. In the Baseline Killer case, DNA became one of the most important tools used to connect Mark Goudeau to the crimes. It represented a powerful idea. Even when a criminal believes they have escaped, evidence can remain. The smallest mistake can eventually become the clue that reveals the truth. The case also became an example studied by investigators examining serial offenders. The behavior of the Baseline Killer showed patterns often seen in violent criminals. The escalation of violence. The desire for control. The ability to maintain an ordinary appearance while committing extraordinary acts. These patterns are important because understanding how offenders operate can help prevent future crimes. Investigators studying cases like this do not only look backward. They look forward. They ask, could something have been detected earlier? Were there warning signs? How can future victims be protected? These questions are difficult because criminal behavior is complex. No single warning sign can always predict what someone will do. But studying past cases allows law enforcement and experts to improve their methods. The Baseline Killer case also left a lasting impact on public awareness. Many people began thinking differently about personal safety. Simple habits changed. People became more aware of their surroundings. Communities became more connected. Neighbors looked out for one another. Fear had brought people together, but so had the desire to prevent similar tragedies from happening again. However, one of the most important parts of remembering the case is recognizing that the story should not belong only to the person who committed the crimes. Serial killers often become the focus of public attention. People become fascinated by their behavior, their psychology, their motives, their crimes. But this attention can unintentionally overshadow the people who suffered. The victims should remain at the center of the story. They were not simply evidence in a criminal case. They were human beings with lives that mattered. The families of Georgia Thompson, Deanna Bodewing, Carmen Miranda, Alfreda Goff, Kimberly Hamilton, and the other victims carried the greatest burden. They had to live with a loss that could never truly be repaired. For them, justice was important. But remembrance was equally important. Remembering who their loved ones were before tragedy. Remembering their personalities, their kindness, their laughter, their everyday moments. Because a victim's story should never begin and end with how they died. They had lives before the crime. They had identities beyond the investigation. The Baseline Killer case also raised difficult questions about how someone like Mark Goudeau could remain unnoticed. How could a person accused of such extreme violence appear normal to those around him? How could someone maintain relationships and interact with society while investigators searched for him? These questions are often examined in criminal psychology. Some offenders are capable of separating different parts of their lives. They can present one image to the world while hiding another. That ability can make them extremely difficult to detect. The case of Mark Goudeau became a disturbing example of that reality. The man eventually convicted as the Baseline Killer was not a stranger who appeared from nowhere. He was someone who had existed within the same community he terrorized. And that realization was one of the most unsettling parts of the entire investigation. Years after the verdict, Mark Goudeau remains on Arizona's death row. The legal process surrounding his conviction continues through appeals, as is common in death penalty cases. But regardless of future legal developments, the impact of the Baseline Killer case has already become part of Arizona history. It changed how Phoenix viewed safety. It changed how investigators approached complex criminal cases. It changed the lives of everyone connected to it. The story began with fear. A city searching for answers. A predator hidden among ordinary people. A series of crimes that seemed impossible to understand. But it ended with something that every victim's family hoped for. Recognition. Accountability. Justice. Yet the final lesson of the Baseline Killer case is not about the man who committed the crimes. It is about the people who survived. The investigators who refused to stop. The families who continued to remember. And the victims whose lives deserve to be spoken about with dignity. Because behind every crime statistic is a person. Behind every headline is a family. And behind every investigation is a story of human lives forever changed. When a criminal case reaches its conclusion, people often search for one final answer. Not just who did it, but why. Why would someone choose to harm innocent people? Why would someone repeatedly commit acts of violence? How could a person live an apparently ordinary life while carrying such a destructive side? The Baseline Killer case left Phoenix with these questions for years. The evidence had revealed what happened. The courtroom had determined responsibility. But understanding the person behind the crimes required looking beyond the events themselves. It required examining behavior, patterns, choices, and the disturbing psychological traits that appeared throughout the investigation. Mark Goudeau was not described by investigators as someone who suddenly became violent overnight. The picture that emerged was more complicated. It was a picture of a person who, according to authorities and court findings, showed a pattern of controlling behavior, manipulation, and escalating violence. The crimes attributed to him did not appear to be random acts of uncontrolled anger. They showed planning, opportunity, and a desire to dominate vulnerable people. This distinction is important when examining violent offenders. Some crimes happen in moments of intense emotion. A person loses control. A situation escalates. A decision is made in seconds. But crimes committed by serial offenders often follow a different pattern. They involve choices. The offender observes. The offender decides. The offender acts. And afterward, the offender may attempt to hide what happened and continue living normally. The baseline killer investigation revealed a man who appeared capable of maintaining two different identities. To people who knew him casually, Mark Goudeau could appear like an ordinary person. He worked in construction. He interacted with others. He had relationships. He existed within the community without attracting the kind of attention people would expect from someone later accused of multiple violent crimes. This ability to appear normal is one of the most disturbing characteristics found in many cases involving serial offenders. The public often imagines dangerous criminals as obvious. Someone who looks threatening. Someone who behaves strangely. Someone who immediately attracts suspicion. But reality is often different. Many offenders understand social behavior. They know how to present themselves. They know what others expect to see. They can create an image that hides their darker actions. This creates a dangerous illusion. The people around them may see only the version they choose to show. The investigation into Goudeau suggested that control was a central element of his crimes. The attacks were not simply about taking possessions. They were about power over another person. The ability to frighten. The ability to control movement. The ability to make someone feel completely helpless. For many violent offenders, this desire for control becomes a key part of their behavior. The victim is not viewed as an individual with feelings and a life. Instead, the victim becomes an object used to satisfy the offender's psychological needs. This mindset represents one of the most disturbing aspects of violent crime. The offender creates a situation where another human being's fear becomes part of the experience. The baseline killer crimes showed a progression that investigators found deeply concerning. The early attacks involved sexual assault and robbery. Over time, the violence increased. Some victims were murdered. This escalation is significant in criminal psychology. When an offender commits crimes repeatedly without being caught, several things can happen. They may become more confident. They may believe they are smarter than investigators. They may take greater risks. The behavior can become more extreme. Each successful crime can reinforce the belief that they can continue. This pattern appeared in the way the baseline killer operated. The attacks became increasingly serious. The consequences became more devastating. The offender appeared willing to move beyond one type of crime into something far more destructive. Another important aspect of the case was the apparent ability to separate his criminal actions from his public identity. This psychological separation is often discussed when examining individuals who commit serious crimes while maintaining ordinary relationships. A person may go home after committing a violent act. They may speak with family members. They may interact with co-workers. They may participate in everyday activities. To outsiders, this can seem impossible. How could someone commit such acts and then behave normally? But some offenders are able to compartmentalize their lives. They create separate worlds. One world where they appear ordinary. Another where they engage in criminal behavior. This ability does not make their actions accidental. It often demonstrates planning and awareness. They understand what they are doing. They understand that society would reject their behavior. And they attempt to hide it. The case also raised questions about previous warning signs. Gudo had a history that included prior accusations and legal issues. These details became important during the trial because prosecutors argued they provided context about his behavior. However, criminal psychology also recognizes an important reality. Not everyone with a criminal history becomes a serial offender. Understanding risk requires examining patterns, not isolated events. In Gudo's case, prosecutors presented the argument that his past behavior, combined with the evidence from the baseline crimes, showed a consistent pattern of violence and control. The jury ultimately accepted that argument. Another factor often examined in serial crime cases is the offender's relationship with empathy. Empathy allows people to recognize and respond to the suffering of others. A person with strong empathy understands that their actions cause pain. Violent offenders may demonstrate a severe lack of empathy toward their victims. They may understand that someone is suffering but do not allow that suffering to stop their behavior. In cases involving repeated violence, this absence of concern becomes one of the most frightening elements. The offender is not simply making one terrible decision. They are repeatedly choosing actions that harm others. The baseline killer case also demonstrated how fear itself can become part of an offender's impact. The physical crimes affected individual victims. But the psychological impact spread across the entire city. People changed their routines. They became more cautious. They questioned their surroundings. In that sense, the offender's influence extended beyond the crime scenes. The fear became another form of harm. A city of millions began adjusting its behavior because of one person. That is one reason serial offenders create such a powerful reaction from communities. Their crimes do not only affect those directly attacked. They affect everyone who begins wondering, could I be next? Could someone I love become a victim? Could danger be closer than I realize? The baseline killer case forced Phoenix to confront those fears. But it also showed the strength of the community. Victims survived. Families demanded justice. Investigators continued working despite enormous pressure. The public refused to forget those who were harmed. Understanding the psychology of Mark Gudo does not mean focusing on him instead of the victims. It means understanding the behaviors that allowed the crimes to happen. It means learning from the warning signs. It means recognizing how dangerous manipulation and control can become when combined with violence. But perhaps the most important conclusion is this. The baseline killer was not created in one moment. The crimes were not the result of one sudden decision. They represented a series of choices. Choices made by one person. Choices that destroyed lives. Choices that forever changed Phoenix. The investigation eventually revealed the identity behind the fear. The courtroom established responsibility. But the psychological questions remain part of the case because they remind society of a difficult truth. The most dangerous individuals are not always the ones who appear different. Sometimes, they are the people who learn how to hide in plain sight. And for more than a year, that was exactly what Mark Gudo did. He lived among the same people who feared the baseline killer. He walked through the same city. He existed behind an ordinary appearance. Until evidence finally exposed the reality hidden beneath the mask, the arrest of Mark Gudo brought relief to Phoenix. The conviction brought a sense of justice. But for law enforcement, the baseline killer case represented something more than the capture of one violent offender. It became a defining moment. A case that tested investigative methods. A case that exposed the challenges of stopping a criminal who operated among ordinary people. A case that demonstrated how science, persistence, and cooperation could eventually reveal the truth. Long after the courtroom proceedings ended, investigators continued studying what happened during the baseline killer investigation. Not because they wanted to revisit the horror, but because every major criminal case leaves behind lessons. Every mistake teaches something. Every success provides a method that can help protect future victims. The baseline killer investigation became an example of how modern law enforcement must adapt when facing a complex serial crime. At the beginning of the investigation, police were dealing with uncertainty. They did not know exactly how many victims existed. They did not know whether the attacks would continue. They did not know the identity of the person responsible. They only knew that something dangerous was happening. The first challenge was connection. When crimes occur separately, investigators often begin by examining each incident individually. A single assault. A single robbery. A single homicide. Each one has its own evidence and circumstances. But serial offenders create a unique problem. The connection between crimes may not be immediately visible. The same person may attack different victims in different locations. The details may appear unrelated. The victims may have nothing in common. The offender may intentionally create confusion. That was one of the major difficulties faced by investigators in Phoenix. They had to recognize that separate crimes were actually pieces of the same puzzle. Once that connection became clear, the entire investigation changed. The question was no longer, who committed this one crime? It became, who has been committing these crimes across the city? That shift required a different approach. Investigators had to think about patterns. They had to analyze behavior. They had to look beyond individual incidents and search for the person responsible for all of them. The creation of the Baseline Killer Task Force represented this new approach. Different areas of expertise were brought together. Detectives, forensic specialists, analysts, investigators with experience in violent crimes. Each person brought a different perspective. One investigator might notice something in a witness statement. Another might identify a forensic connection. Another might recognize a behavioral pattern. Together, these pieces created a larger picture. The investigation also highlighted the growing importance of DNA technology. For decades, solving crimes often depended heavily on eyewitness testimony. A witness identifying a suspect could become the central part of a case. But eyewitness memory has limitations. People experience fear differently. Stress can affect memory. Details can become unclear over time. DNA evidence changed the way investigators approached many cases. Scientific evidence could provide information that human memory could not. In the Baseline Killer investigation, DNA became one of the strongest tools connecting evidence to Mark Goudeau. It demonstrated a powerful principle of modern criminal justice. The smallest trace can carry enormous importance. A piece of biological evidence invisible to the human eye can become the key to solving crimes that once seemed impossible. The case also showed the importance of preserving evidence carefully. Crime scenes are moments that cannot be recreated. Once a location changes, information can be lost forever. The work of forensic specialists requires patience and precision. A single overlooked detail can affect an entire investigation. A single preserved sample can eventually change everything. Beyond science, the Baseline Killer investigation also showed the importance of victims and survivors in solving crimes. In many cases, survivors are the first people who provide investigators with information about the offender. Their memories, their descriptions, their willingness to participate. All of these things can become essential. But doing so often requires extraordinary courage. For survivors of violent attacks, participating in an investigation can mean reliving painful experiences. They must answer questions about moments they would rather forget. They must face memories connected to fear and trauma. Yet many choose to speak because they understand that their voices may prevent someone else from suffering. Their role in the Baseline Killer case was not simply providing evidence. They helped create a path toward justice. They transformed personal suffering into information that could protect others. The investigation also revealed the challenges created by media attention. Cases involving serial offenders often attract enormous public interest. News coverage can help police receive information. It can encourage witnesses to come forward. It can keep attention on unsolved crimes. But intense media attention can also create pressure. The public wants immediate answers. People want someone arrested. They want fear to end. However, investigators must work differently from public opinion. They cannot simply identify someone because they seem suspicious. They need evidence. They need facts. They need a case strong enough to survive in court. The Baseline Killer investigation showed the importance of patience. A rushed investigation can create mistakes. A careful investigation can create justice. Another major lesson from the case involved communication. Large criminal investigations often involve many agencies and many individuals. Without cooperation, important information can be missed. A detective working on one part of a case may not know that another department has discovered something important. Sharing information becomes essential. The Baseline Killer case demonstrated why modern investigations increasingly rely on collaboration. Criminals do not respect jurisdiction lines. They move through communities. They exploit gaps. Law enforcement must work together to close those gaps. The case also changed public awareness about personal safety. Before the Baseline Killer attacks, many people moved through Phoenix without considering the possibility of becoming victims of a serial offender. Afterward, routines changed. People became more aware of their surroundings. Communities became more connected. Neighbors looked after each other. The fear was painful, but it also created stronger awareness. People learned that safety is not only the responsibility of police. Communities play an important role. Paying attention. Reporting suspicious behavior. Supporting victims. Helping neighbors. These actions can make a difference. The Baseline Killer case also became a reminder that appearances can be misleading. One of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation was the realization that the person responsible was not someone who existed outside society. He was someone who appeared ordinary. Someone who could interact with others. Someone who could hide behind a normal appearance. This reality forced many people to reconsider how they understood danger. Criminal behavior does not always announce itself. Some individuals are capable of presenting one image to the world while hiding another. That does not mean people should live in constant fear. But it does demonstrate why evidence, awareness, and community cooperation matter. Years after the investigation ended, the Baseline Killer remains one of Arizona's most significant criminal cases. The name Mark Goudeau remains connected to fear and tragedy. But the larger legacy of the case belongs to those who worked to uncover the truth. The detectives who followed every lead. The forensic experts who analyzed every piece of evidence. The survivors who found the courage to speak. The families who demanded justice. And the victims whose lives must never be reduced to the crimes committed against them. The investigation changed Phoenix. It changed how law enforcement approached complex criminal cases. It changed how people thought about safety. It changed the lives of everyone connected to it. But perhaps the most important lesson from the baseline killer case is that justice is rarely achieved through one moment. It is built slowly. Through evidence. Through determination. Through people refusing to give up. The search for the baseline killer lasted more than a year. But the search for truth lasted much longer. And in the end, it was not fear that defined Phoenix. It was the determination to confront that fear and find justice.